Okay. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're joining us. Thank you for joining us today for this important webinar. I think would give room for like 5 minutes to get more people to join us. And while we're waiting for others, for those of us that are here, can we like drop our location and our names from wherever we are? Thank you. Please make use of the chat box to drop your information, your location, and your name. Thank you. Okay, we have David Daramola from Lagos. Thank you for joining. Olumide from Lagos. Thank you for joining us. Oyin, thank you for joining us. Tolu, thank you for joining us. Okay, we have one person from Abuja, Ifeolu Ayeni. Thank you for joining us. Timothy from Lagos, thank you for joining us. Okay, we're about 47 in the room now. Joseph Upmong from Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you for joining us. Titus Aranilewa Shiroro from Niger State. Thank you for joining us. David from Ogun State. Thank you for joining us. Michael from Abuja. We can see you. Thank you. Pongyamba from Abuja. Thank you for joining us. Okay, we have like 2 minutes left. Pego, thank you for joining us. Goodness, Gimbia as well. Thank you for joining us as well. We have 1 minute before we commence the session. Olubumi Jegede from Mina, Niger State. Thank you for joining us. Mojisola Oduni from Lagos. Thank you for joining us as well. Thompson Ekomobong from Akwa Ibom. Thank you for joining us. We have 62 people in the room as we speak. All right, I think we can start now while others join us. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening once again from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Banjo Luashe, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar session. And the topic we are going to look at today is ESG regulatory requirements in Nigeria and Africa. And today we have incredible lineup of speakers who are actually experts in the field of ESG and sustainability. They'll be sharing their expertise and insights on evolving regulatory landscape and what it means for different organizations in Nigeria and across Africa as a whole. And I'll be introducing our speakers to us. And our first speaker today is Olakweju Ibekwe, the Chief Executive Officer of Stellion Foundation. And she's the forefront of driving our sustainable initiatives through our leadership at the Stellion Foundation. And she's been making significant strides in community development and sustainability. I think we can use the React button to clap for Olakweju Ibekwe. Please, I want to believe you all can hear me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And next we have
thank you very much.
Next we have Mrs. Bolanle Adekoya. She's part of PwC Africa Leadership Team, and she heads the corporate reporting service business for West Market Africa. She also leads the PwC Capital Markets Accounting Advisory Services Group as well. And she has over 23 years professional service experience supporting clients through complex corporate reporting issues, deal structuring, capital raise, transformation, as well as financial and sustainability advisory across industries, power, oil and gas, manufacturing, and the public sector. And lastly, please, can we all clap for her? Let's use the real button to clap as well. All right, thank you very much, Ma. And finally, we have Dr. Bankole in the room, Dr. Bankole Alibe, the Chief Executive Officer of the CDL Center for Sustainability and Participatory Development. Dr. Bankole is a leading voice in sustainability development with a deep understanding of how participatory approaches can drive impactful change. Dr. Bankole is an international environmental and social risks and impact management expert. And over the last 17 years, he has gained valuable work experience providing a range of end-to-end sustainability solutions. So let's also clap for Dr. Bankole. Let's welcome him.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So we'll go straight into the business of the day, and our first speaker is Olakweju Ibekwe, the CEO of Sterling One Foundation. Over to you, Ma. Hello, Kweju.
Hello, Sheyi. Trust you're doing great. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Very well, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to appreciate everyone who has joined us today from different parts of the globe. A good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening to you from wherever you're joining us from. We are glad to host you again on the ESG webinar series, which we execute in partnership with different I want to confirm if you can see my slides. If you can't see my slides, Sheyi, could you please help put up my slides?
Okay, I'll do that now.
Thank you very much. So while Sheyi is on that, I'll just take us through history. We started this ESG webinar series sometime earlier this year against the backdrop of the identified ignorance we find in our ecosystem, and of course, the rapidly evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance regulation across the globe and also in our clime. It started as a workshop at the 2023 edition of the Africa Social Impact Summit, and that gap was identified, and the need to close that gap is why we are here today, working with our amazing partners. And of course, Lagos Business School Sustainability Center. I didn't mention them before. So today, my assignment is pretty short, if I'll use that word. I'm just going to take us through a short overview of ESG regulatory requirements. For those of us that have not been a part of this webinar series from when we started, ESG basically stands for environment, social, and governance. Please, you can move on the slides, Shay. We're going to be speaking on a brief overview of ESG, a brief overview of the regulatory environment, and then we take it on to the extremely insightful presentations we're going to be having from Dr. Bankole and Ms. Bolanle from PwC. So as most of us in the room already know, ESG stands for environment, social, and governance, and its significance over the last couple of years has increased significantly, and we find that various executives across the globe are identifying that it is best for them to integrate ESG requirements in their businesses. The initiatives based on data now from Marsh based in the UK has shown that companies that have integrated ESG requirements in their businesses have outperformed competition over 2 decades. So this is not just communication based on verbal assessment or opinions. It's based on data. Aligning with ESG principles has proven to do good for business with reference to profitability, efficiency, and sustainability for these organizations. Also, for the benefit of those that have not been part of this series, environment includes how we monitor our greenhouse gas emissions as businesses, energy management, water management, ecological impact, basically how we take care of the environment and ensure that the business operations do not negatively impact the environment in which we operate. Of course, social includes labor practices, how you take care of your internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. External stakeholders include the communities within which you operate. How do you relate with them? How do you ensure that that community is also a safe haven for not just the organization, but those within that community? And internally, what are your policies? What are your diversity and inclusion policies? What are your safe practices to ensure there's safety, is a safe environment for your human capital to ensure they're able to deliver their responsibilities efficiently? And for governance, of course, we talk about ethics, legal and regulatory compliance, and how we ensure that our competitive behavior is also not harmful. I'm dropping this quote, which is a recent study by IBM, which I had shared in the past, that business value, IBM Institute for Business Value, found that 76% of executives say ESG is central to their business strategy, and more than 72% approach it as a revenue enabler rather than a cost center. This corroborates my initial point based on data from Marsh in the UK, that ESG is good for profitability for any business. And a quick overview of the regulatory environment. ESG regulations have evolved over time, and they're basically a set of guidelines and standards that organizations must adhere to demonstrate that they are responsible socially and environmentally in their societies. And these regulations cover a wide range of topics under the E, S, and G that I shared with you earlier. These regulations are mandatory. And if you do not adhere to them in some climes, it can completely lead to the closure of your business. In other words, it's something that the private sector must take very, very seriously, especially private sector organizations that have scope beyond Nigeria and Africa, but they do a lot of business with international organizations. And these regulations also vary by geography. A few challenges I'm going to highlight for the sake of my time. These regulations are fast evolving. As a matter of fact, a research I came across from ESG book stated that ESG regulations have increased by over 150% since the last 10 years. It's amazing that over the last decade, these regulations have evolved significantly. What does that tell us? We always need to be abreast of the facts because the information we had as at yesterday may have changed as at today. Also, these regulations are fragmented. They lack standardization and they are not sufficiently enforced. We have also issues around greenwashing, but I do not want to go into those details. This is basically an overview. I took this slide from one of the slides shared by Dr. Irene Robinson Ayonwale during her first presentation, which gives all of us just a snapshot of the global ESG landscape, which has to do with the regulations, the reporting frameworks, and the global goals. All of these regulations we're talking about today will require reporting frameworks for adherence. And then these all now lead to the global goals, Agenda 2030, Agenda 2063, and any other agenda we're going to have following those agendas I just shared. Now, this gives us a snapshot of what's happening across the globe. Over 75 countries have one form of ESG regulation or the other. Shayi, you can go to the next slide. The shaded countries on this map of the world that we see here, they all have some form of regulations, laws, or voluntary standards that impact ESG related issues. Is the previous slide. And I really like this slide. And the source is there on the slide, from Canada to North America, to Africa, to Asia, every part, South America, every part of the globe, every continent has some form of ESG regulation or the other. So this is a global trend and it is here to stay. And that's one thing I just want to emphasize. And they all have come under different names, other different jurisdictions. Argentina is Sustainable and ESG Collective Investment Products 2021. We have in Indonesia, Abu Dhabi, and different, these are just a few of them. I already mentioned that they're over 75. And of course, in Nigeria, which we are going to get more information on, we have the guidelines for implementation of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. And there are quite a number of other regulations that our expert speakers will share more information on. Interestingly, according to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, which is an international network of financial institutions who manage over $123 trillion. They found that more than as at 2021, more than double the amount of new or revised policy instruments have been adopted than any year before. So there's an upward trend in the adoption of these policies. In other words, these policies are not just coming into place. These regulations are not just coming into place. They also require adoption. And I'm emphasizing this also for those in the room. This session is not just for us to listen and go away. It's for us to confirm what is our level of adoption of these principles in our businesses, in our operations. What do we need to change? What do we need to improve on? And that is the essence of this session. So it's extremely important that we do not just listen, but we act. Sheyi, you can move the slides. And finally, deadlines are looming around the world. There are so many regulations from, you can move forward, please. There are so many regulations from the US to the UK to Brazil, regulations to go into effect in 2023, in 2024, in 2025, in 2026, in 2027, in 2029. Please proceed to the next slide, please. And I think that's it. So I would say that this is an era of alignment with ESG globally. For us in the room, now is a time for us to first get abreast of the fact, know what is required in our climb, wherever you might be in Nigeria or across the continent. And now is the time to act. I'll leave you with this quote by Sylvian Wernstein, the Executive Director of Climate Change Investment Research at MSCI. And he says that we know how to reach net zero, however challenging it is. If we did not know before, during this session, we would know, and that's why we're all here. So I must commend everyone who is in the room now, because you are here, because you're interested in knowing, and thank you for joining us. Now is the time to act. On that note, I would like to say thank you so much while I hand over the virtual mic to Sheyi and subsequently to Ms. Abim Bolanle. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Wiju, and it was quite insightful. Next, would our next speaker, I'll be handing the virtual mic to Mrs. Bolanle Adekoya from PwC. She'll be taking us on ESG regulatory landscape across Africa. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm glad to be here, and thank you very much, Olapeju, for setting the scene. I just want to confirm that everyone can see my slide. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, so I'm going to be going deeper into the regulatory landscape across Africa. The truth about it is that it's important to understand that when it comes to ESG regulation, because of the broad nature of ESG, the different components under each of the pillars, there is not just like one regulation. You have regulation around reporting, which is what people tend to think about. You have regulation around actual strategy, and you have regulation around whether it's employment, whether it's environmental. So when you think about the GHG emissions, you have regulations around governance, all the different governance pillars. So whether you're using the OECD or you're using the FRC Governance Act or the SEC Governance Act or the Code of Conduct, there's so many. So it's important that we get to familiarize yourself. So depending on the company that you are in and the industry that you're in and the country that you're in, there'll be quite a number of things that will be applicable to you. So please familiarize yourself with it. This session will not go through everything. We'll go through the general ones that are common amongst various industry, but there will be other ones that you need to think about. So just briefly, when you're thinking about ESG, we've talked about the environmental pillar earlier on when you talk about what it means for climate change, how you use natural resources, how you manage the byproducts and the waste, and then opportunities that are there. So I wanted to highlight that in the face of all these regulations, you also have to understand that it's an opportunity and it's time for us to be responsible in our business and move our strategy beyond strategy of what we do with profits, but actually thinking about all stakeholders. Same thing with the social pillar, same thing with the governance pillar. So the importance of ESG in global markets. Earlier on, Olakpeju had already mentioned this, but I think it's important that we talk about it. Remember that a lot of times companies get frustrated with, they always think, oh, regulators are making us, comply with this, comply with that. But the truth about it is that a lot of these things are there for safeguarding. They're there to help us create value in the long term, because the more and more we cultivate the earth, the more and more we use resources, including people, there can be abuse. And in the end, what is left for others coming? Our population, the population of the world is growing. Africa is the new frontier. So we need to look at it beyond. So the wide-ranging responsibilities that you have to understand that as you comply with these standards and regulations that are in the global market, there are benefits to you. You are supporting long-term value creation. You are attracting talent. So even think about it. Nowadays, Olakpeju gave some statistics, and I will talk about some statistics shortly. Nowadays, a lot of new employees will not go to companies that they feel are not ethically correct. Yes, they will do it, even when it comes to things like buying clothes, buying food, the choices that people are making. There's more choice now. So people need to think about this. And this is apart from the things like access to capital and reduction in cost of funding that can have. The other thing that you also have to understand, with the breadth of social media, reputation can change, brand reputation can change very easily. So it's important that people are responsible. The people that you also use as your vendors, remember that the ESG regulation is not just for you as a company, it is for everyone that is associated with you as well. So if you think about things around labor laws, what does that mean in that sense? And things that will so differentiate you as a brand. Because now people are now even willing to pay a little bit extra for companies that make ESG as the forefront in them. PwC does an annual investor survey that we share on a global basis. And the last one, look at some of the things that people are talking about now. They're talking about the fact that top priority for investors, making sure that people are environmentally savvy. Investors want to ensure that people are doing the right thing, no greenwashing. People are asking, investors want to be confident that as an organization, you are doing the right thing and making sure that, if you look at the top one, 78% of investors say that managing regulatory risk is an important factor in including in sustainability investment decisions. One of the things I want to mention here, that even though your company or your business might be operating in one country, remember that your vendors, your supply chain, your organization, different things that may concern you might actually, even your stakeholders and your shareholders might be involved in other countries. So please do not just think about Africa in isolation. Think about all that chain and know that there might be some ESG regulations that might also apply to you. The other thing to just talk about here, the impact of government regulations. It is expected that in the next 3 years, that there will be moderate to extreme influence on the company's value generation. Yes, what's the value generation as a result of government regulations? Because the thing about it is that governments are now being forced to say that if companies do not self-govern, they will do it. So the likelihood is that there will be more and more government regulations around sustainability that will come up. And remember what I said, sustainability is not just about looking at environmental factors. The environmental factors tend to be the quick one that people tend to look at. but there's actually a lot more around it. So whether it's social issues as well. So please bear that in mind. So we have the various African countries. Can you see here? We've got East Africa, Francophone Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, and then look at global. So you can see that it is expected that from an African perspective, there's expected to be more impact. And the reason for that is because the global guys started with regards to sustainability ages ago, around 30, 40 years ago, with the introduction of something they called the triple bottom line. Yeah, the triple bottom line, which is when you look at growth and when you look at impact, not just looking at your profit, but actually looking at your overall impact as an organization. Africa is just catching up. And so it's expected that we're going to see more and more impact of this over the years. So I'm not going to talk about this, but this is a nutshell of the various frameworks and regulations that are currently here. So you have things around the reporting frameworks, GIR, which is Global Reporting Initiative, which is quite a popular one that people are aware of. There's also the Sustainability Reporting Standards. There's also the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is the IFRS S1 and S2. I'll talk about those shortly, which we in Africa already starting to adopt. There's there's of course the other frameworks, the TCFD, the ones that are very focused around environment. So things like the Greenhouse Protocol, which we all, some of us would have heard about, the ESG principles, and then of course the fact that there are a number of ratings, sustainability ratings and rankings, which investors look at when they are making choices around who they should invest in. So I'm not going to go into detail because I have I believe another speaker is going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. But let's just move on and let's look at this. So another thing I wanted to talk about quickly before I go into the standards across Africa. A lot of times people go, sustainability reporting, ESG, CSR, what is the difference? Now, I wanted to put this picture here because the fact is that even though we're talking about ESG today, ESG is just an aspect of sustainability as a whole. Sustainability within the landscape of sustainability, even though that there's similarities in there, it's important to understand that ESG is an aspect of it. But within sustainability, you have ESG, you have our corporate social responsibility, and you have sustainability reporting. All of them are interconnected. However, they are not the same. We need to educate ourselves around this because a lot of time people focus on just either the reporting, people focus just on the environment, people focus just on the social, people focus on the CSR. However, it is everything. And it's important that responsible companies make sure that they put in a strategy as well as processes to ensure they're looking at sustainability in the long term. So as the company is changing, is growing, employees changing, the different things that you're doing as you're expanding, these things are moving with your organization. So now let's move on to Africa's sustainability reporting landscape. And I'm going to start with Nigeria since Sterling is based in Nigeria. So let's start with Nigeria. One of the things that you will know and we're very proud of is that Nigeria was the first country in Africa to actually adopt the International Sustainability Standards, IFRS S1 and S2, as issued by the board. That is a big thing, and we need to keep, put our hands together for ourselves. The truth about it is that these standards, so IFRS S1 and S2, these standards are not they're not off the cuff. What do I mean? They require quite a lot of effort to adopt. So for example, the IFRS S1 standard, which talks about the general sustainability standards, and then the S2 that talks about the climate related disclosure reporting. A lot of companies, when we first started, so the first announcement was made in June 2023. That was the first announcement that was made in June 2023. And there was an ambition that was saying that significant pies, listed companies would be able to adopt this standard. However, as FRC, I was also on the committee that was looking at this. When we started looking at adoption, we realized actually a lot of us say a lot of things in our financial statements, but we do not have the data to back it up. We was realized that actually we were being very optimistic about who could adopt and who could not adopt. And the truth about it is that a lot of companies did not actually have the right processes in place to be able to gather the information. A lot of companies did not have the personnel to drive it. They also found out that it was not the priority of stakeholders in there. And so the FRC had to then come up with a roadmap of implementation, which is what you are seeing here. The phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 are in that set, and they had to give it time. So for phase 1, they put out a statement to encourage early adopters. So they asked for companies who would be early adopters. There were about 10 companies that were, that came forward and wanted to early adopt. However, by the time their statements were reviewed and the different assertions that were made, because the FRC were really rigorous in how they looked at, who they would call early adopters, only 4 listed companies made it, and that was Seplat, MTN, Fidelity Bank, and Access Bank. So well done to them. But what you also see is that the reason why these companies were able to make it is because they had already started their sustainability journey. So for example, an Access Bank had already issued a sustainability green bond. So for them to have been able to succeed in that, they had to do a lot of work in there. So you see that it's actually quite a lot of work to be able to comply with some of these regulations. Same thing with Seplat. Seplat has had a separate sustainability reporting for a while. MTN as well have also had that. They even have with their foundation, they have been able to do this. And then Fidelity last year as well went through a very significant drive. I'm aware about all of them because they're all my clients. And so I see the amount of effort that they have. They have a team, an army that are doing this, making sure that reporting is done, not just internally, as well as externally. And then I can show you that it has reaped benefits for them as well. So that's the first phase of people who reported as at 31st of December, 2023. The next phase, which we're currently in, is the voluntary adoption, phase 2. So people that want to voluntarily adopt it. There are quite a number of people that can help you with, if you want to start your sustainability journey, you can speak to quite a number of us. We know what we're doing. And then there's the mandatory adoption and then government organizations. You will want to know that actually in places like Europe, so when you think about these, their own corporate sustainability reporting disclosure standards, so CSRD, for somewhere like Europe, they are already doing mandatory adoption because, as I said, they have gone through the journey and they're at a place. So we are still lucky because we have about 4 years before mandatorily we all have to adopt. And then for SMEs, they now do 2030. But it's important that for Nigeria, other sustainability, so this is just looking at sustainability reporting, other sustainability standards align with this, because currently we do have other regulations, which I'll talk about shortly, that are not aligned when it comes to the timing of adoption. So we need to work on that as well. And then government organizations, of course, cannot be left out because they also have an impact on society. Underneath it, I just wanted to talk about assurance. So the truth about it is that, you can talk about all the things that you want to do and that you're doing, But the fact is that it must be measured. There has to be accountability. Accountability is one of the principles that comes when it comes to sustainability reporting, with all the things that you're doing. And within those ones, when you're measuring your materiality or your opportunities around sustainability and the risks around that, you have to, have an independent party look at them and actually certify them. That's what assurance means. So in Nigeria, the FRC has asked that by the 3rd and 4th year of reporting your sustainability standards, you should be actually doing what we call limited assurance. So there'll be key material items in your sustainability risk that you should be having an independent party actually certifying. So assurance that needs to be done. It has to be an independent party. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big four, even though it would be good for it to be big four, but there are other companies that do it. But this is what is required. And then by the 5th year of reporting, you are going to move to reasonable assurance. Reasonable assurance is like doing an audit. I'm sure some of you have heard of the term integrated reporting. So it's something along those lines. But one area of sustainability reporting that's quite difficult to assure on is on what we call the scope 3 GHG emissions. And the reason for that is because the scope 3 is not just looking at your impact, but it's also looking at all the impact of those people who are external to you, your vendors, which can be very difficult to capture because to require significant data collection, it will require buying from them and then monitoring as well as some policies and structures around you. So it's quite a long way to go, but it's something that needs to be there. So we all need to prepare. And even though it might feel quite like, we're looking at 3 to 6 years down the line, I am telling you that it will come very quickly, because for you to be able to have meaningful, comparable, and transparent information, you need to start building your data now. So I will talk about what good reporting looks like later. So let's look at other Africans' sustainability reporting landscape across other countries. So I've bucketed them into various areas, and I've gone for sort of the main countries that are actually looking at it. So if you remember Olapeju's diagram, these are some of the countries that were shaded on her diagram. So for example, Kenya, I'll start with Kenya. Now, Kenya has expressed an intention to adopt ISSB standards. And even though there's still the adoption date is just being finalized and they're having ongoing discussions with regulators and the ISS board members, it's important to know that on Kenya Stock Exchange, they have actually put in some additional requirements for companies to actually have some type of sustainability awareness and strategy and thing in there. So they've already done that, even though they are not fully reporting the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. So it's important that we are aware about that. Ghana and Zimbabwe are also in talks now. We had thought Ghana was going to adopt the ISSB IFRS S1 and S2 standards this year. They have not done that yet, but I can tell you now that they're currently going through capacity building with even people like Bank of Ghana, their capital markets. They are looking at all these things at the moment. And then Zimbabwe as well have mentioned it. And Zimbabwe, a lot of times, Zimbabwe tends to sort of follow what South Africa is doing. They sort of listen because they're next door to that as well. Now, South Africa have a corporate governance regulation called the King's 4 report, which they expect companies to do. And what they have done in that, if you look at some of the enhanced requirements in that King's 4 report, there are actually already aspects of sustainability that are already in there. So things around the social and the governance are covered in there. So that is already being done. In addition to that, their regulator, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and the capital market, already have a voluntary requirement around climate disclosure. And the truth about it is that because it attracts investors, they need to do this, because especially if they're looking for foreign investors who are already asking for these things, they need to do that. So it's important that, you know, they're already halfway there. So at the moment, the last bit of it is looking at the IFRS S1 and S2 IFRS S1 and S2 reporting standards. Bearing in mind that some of their companies are already reporting on the GRI. In addition to that, there are some companies that already have dual listing in places like Europe, who are also doing the EU ESRS standards as well as the CSRD standards as well. So they already halfway there. The last bit of it is just sort of to decide when they're going to adopt the IFRS S2 and S1 standards. Another country is Tanzania. Tanzania is in East Africa. They're not far away from Uganda and Kenya. Now, Tanzania entities are required to incorporate sustainability disclosures in line with ISSB standards in their director's report from this year. Yeah. So even though it is not, it's not every single one, but it's expected that in their director's report, there is responsibility for them to disclose that. So a lot of Tanzanian companies are already looking at this, making sure that it incorporates it. Because remember, we want to go beyond just surface reporting when it comes to sustainability standard. Because of the extent of it, it has to be embedded within the organization. And so the reporting by the directors to support that also needs to make sure that the data is transparent and accurate and also usable. Zambia is another East African country that had early adopted IFRS S1 along IFRS S2 with integrated reporting. So now integrated reporting, it's important to note that integrated reporting is part of the requirements of a lot of governance frameworks. So a lot of the corporate governance frameworks, one of the things that you will find that they will talk about is integrated reporting. So integrated reporting is very similar to what Sarbanes-Oxley is, people who know about the SOX standard. So integrated reporting is saying, I don't just want you to look at financial reporting. I also want you to look at non-financial reporting as well as the controls that surround that in that sense. So it's a holistic approach, going beyond just historical performance, but also looking at the future and looking at your overall impact to your various stakeholders as well. Please, we have a session for questions and answer later on. So if you have any questions, please, you can either post them or you can, hold on to them and then we can try and address some of those later on. Thank you. So ESG regulations in Africa. As I mentioned earlier on, there are quite a number of laws and regulations and guidelines all around there. And, so I'm going to talk about some of them, but this is not exhaustive because there's quite a lot. Like even in Nigeria, we have quite a lot. So we have things around labor laws, we have things around environmental laws, we have things around governance. As I said, I talked about corporate governance, that's there. So there's quite a number of things that are there, but we have tried to look at some of those. So let's look about analysis of ESG regulations in key African markets. So as I said, I've just chosen some here. So at Nigeria, we have the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria that regulates ESG activities of the country. You'd have seen that they were inaugurated towards the end of last year. So they are currently putting in some guidelines to help companies in certain industry to comply, especially around manufacturing and oil and gas as well. What you will find is that the financial services companies in Nigeria tend to comply easier. And the reason for that is because they're used to certain regulations around the SEC and what's called a CBN already. So there are certain things that they're already doing that's helping them. Well, of course, people will be surprised when I say that CAMA is actually an ESG regulation, because CAMA will tell you how frequently you need to have your assurance. It will tell you composition when it comes to the committees that you have to have around governance in there. So that's in the cell we mustn't ignore. There's, of course, the Climate Change Act, which is very, very important to us as well, which is sort of looking at your impact and how you're also managing your climate transition as well. The CBN also issued, I talked about CBN earlier on, general and sector sustainability banking principles in there. So these ones, as I said, there's quite a lot, and we only have, I don't have all this, so I can't go through the detail of some of these things, but please familiarize yourself with this. There's, of course, also the NGX Sustainability Reporting and Disclosure Guidelines that were issued as well. The NGX works very, very closely with the FRC as well. They also have people who were part of the implementation and roadmap committee for the implementation of the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. They're also in connection with the ISSB board. Of course, we all have who's one of the pioneer board members of the ISSB board. So, we're very proud that she's on there and she's been guiding us through all of this. Then, of course, the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance issued by the FRC, which also has certain guidelines around governance and social. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier on the set corporate governance guidelines. So you can see earlier on, a lot of people tend to think ESG, they just think environment, but actually it's a lot deeper than that, because as Olakweju said earlier, you've got the components around environment, you've also got the components around social, and then you have the components around governance. Now, looking at South Africa as well, the large, South Africa is now sort of slightly overtaking Nigeria, but we're coming back with being the largest company because of our exchange rate issues, but we're coming strongly in Nigeria soon. So the South African Constitution, Justifiable Bill of Rights, that includes various social economic rights. Now, it's important that we talk about this. So as you know, in South Africa, they have what we call the ACI targets for companies. So that's around the Employment Equity Act 1998, where in South Africa, companies need to have certain percentage of ownership, for example, of businesses, that rest with Asian, coloreds, and Blacks. You also have the things around gender that's very important as well. So all of these things are all part of ESG as well. There's, of course, the climate change bill that's sort of looking at energy transition as well as waste in that thing around the environmental law. And these environmental laws, they have specific key ones that also go through, depending on the area that you are in, the protected areas, you also need to make sure that you comply with and you record what you are doing. The King 4 report, I talked about corporate governance as well that you need to look at. And then they are also signatories to the various, various international instruments, including the Paris Agreement. So one of the things I wanted to also mention to you is that, a lot of people have been talking about the World Economic Forums, the COP events where a lot of countries go, and when our leaders go to these companies, they actually sign up to some of these events and actually commit us to particular emissions. So, for example, somewhere like Nigeria, originally there was supposed to be, we're supposed to cut our emissions, I think they said by 30% by 2035, and then we're expected to be net zero by 2050. However, I know they've now moved it to 2060. So before we can get there, it's a collective effort to do that. And that is where some of these environmental laws have come into. So someone like, as I said, like in South Africa, who actually signed up to some of these events, they themselves are now looking towards it. And they're going to be putting in strict fines to make sure that companies are complying. So, for example, even somewhere like in Nigeria now, where we have now banned, or Lagos State, we banned the use of styrofoam because they don't. It's non-biodegradable. So these are the type of things that we need to do very soon. The next will be things around diapers, baby diapers. So you can see that these things are quite broad. Another one is Ghana. The Constitution of Ghana, things around the Labor Act, the Environmental Protection Act. As we all know, Ghana has a lot of mining as well, even though in places like in Adamawa as well in Nigeria, we also need to start looking at even around the petroleum. I know that the petroleum Industry Act is there, but there's also mining laws that we would also need to look at from a Nigerian perspective to be able to deal with this as well. So the Minerals and Mining Act for Ghana, the Companies Act, very similar to CAMA, commissions around human rights, state interest and governance authorities. Then, of course, there's the Securities Industry Act, which is very similar to our SEC requirements as well. So these are very, very important things that you need to familiarize yourself with, and as an organization that you need to look at. Kenya and Zambia in the east. So I'll talk about southwest. This is the east. Similar standards. So things around looking at the banking regulations, things around the Securities and Exchange Commission. They've actually put in a manual. I told you that I mentioned earlier on that these Nairobi Stock Exchange were already putting together a manual, so they already have that in there. Same thing with their capital markets there. They are also a signatory to the Paris Agreement as well, and of course all the corporate governance acts in there. Very similar as well. Even Zambia have an occupational health and safety. So health and safety is also part of ESG, and we must look at that. And they, because of the other natural resources they also have a forest act. So the fact that you cannot cut down certain trees, age of trees, to just ensure that we're keeping greenhouse gases in check as well. So why is it important? Why is ESG important? And what are the key compliance requirements in a business? Now, as I mentioned earlier on, safety and protection. The integration of ESG principles cannot be ignored anymore. The board, so when you think about organizations, when it comes to composition of competencies, diversity is actually a brilliant thing. Earlier on, Olakweju mentioned the statistics that companies who have ESG top of mind and who have things around the social side with regards to diversity actually outperform their peers. So a lot of times these regulations, in even places like Africa, we don't tend to do things or comply with things if we're not forced to. So the truth about it is that these regulations are there to force us and accelerate how we're supposed to act to ensure that we're protecting the environment and everything that we are involved in as business owners. So the ESG regulations are there to strengthen board's responsibility to look at what the various aspects, instead of just thinking about profit, because it's beyond profits now. It helps us to align goals and targets. It brings about transparency and comparability. So you will notice now that with the various ESG standards that are in place to actually bring about transparency and comparability. So it's easier for even investors to be able to, know what's going on. And then you also help us to even establish policies to identify and mitigate things like significant risks. Because when it comes to sustainability reporting and the various areas, people talk about the risks and opportunities, and then being able to categorize them in accordance with the materiality of your organization, how material they are to you as an organization. So it will improve your ESG management and then enhance your reporting quality. One of the things that you also notice is that when COVID happened, COVID actually was a mirror, because what happened was that COVID actually helped us realize how behind organizations were. And you will notice that companies who had not gone forward early enough dealing with ESG thing actually suffered more in COVID, because guess what? Those of you who are able to work across diverse teams, be able to do remote working, all these things, policies in place, health and safety for staff, we're actually able to thrive more. So it's important, and we're very grateful for some of these standards, because they're there to sort of push us forward to make sure that we're able to still run our businesses 20, 30, 50 years down the line. So what are the challenges? So I'm almost done. I've got about 5 minutes left. So what are the challenges in the Nigerian context when it comes to ESG and sustainability reporting? And the truth about it is that we still have a long way to go. And these sessions are very, very important for us in Africa. The first one I would say is probably lack of awareness. A lot of people still, as I said, earlier when I was talking about ESG versus sustainability, a lot of people still mix them up, not understanding some of these terms. And the reason for that is because they are all encompassing. It's not just financial, it's not just non-financial. There's so many things and so many components of it. And that is why you will find that people are not aware of why you need to, because people just think about it. The other thing is capacity constraints. The truth about it is that because there's so many concepts, aspects of it, a lot of companies struggle to do. But the first thing that you need to even first of all start with your ESG data. So one of the things I actually forgot, I didn't mention, that I think we need to talk about when it comes to ESG is actually things around tax. So we mustn't forget tax as well, because there are actually tax opportunities that actually come when we do ESG properly. There are actually tax opportunities that can actually come with it. There's even things around the circular economy you can actually make. So when you think about circular economy is looking at things around recycling and looking at how you can reuse resources in that sense. So there are opportunities around these things, things like carbon trading and everything. So it's not all bad, but the truth about it, there are capacity constraints because people do not really know. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the resources. At the moment, a lot of people are just tagging on ESG and sustainability reporting to their finance team or their investor relation team or somebody that's sitting inside internal audit. However, it is the responsibility of management and those charged with governance to make sure they put in the right practices in place, afford the time, the resources, the processes to make sure that ESG compliance is done properly. Another issue that we're having in Nigeria is just limited guidelines. The truth about it is that even though we have the roadmap, when you look at the compliance aspect and the various areas of it, there is limited guidelines, but the guidelines are available. It's just that we have not embedded it in our practices and in individuals. But of course, you can always hire a consultant to sort of help you through the journey or put a team together to help you through the journey. But it's something that we need to do sooner rather than later. Thank God for the likes of the GIR that I mentioned earlier on that are already there. There's a lot of guidelines around it. Even the GIR, they're currently even looking at sector-specific guidelines that they're putting in place, and they're actually speaking to some of our organizations to be involved in it, because to make sure that it covers the whole world in that sense. And then the last thing I'll say is also the high cost of it. The truth about it is that even though we talk about the benefits of ESG later on, it is quite costly to implement. Opportunities for Nigeria, there's improved access to finance. That would, of course, happen. There's reduced risk. I talked about the fact that what happened with COVID. It helps to differentiate you, and it will increase your competitiveness to the world, and it will improve reputation. Because I can tell you now, a lot of companies, they're looking for companies that are able to, who are able to comply with, those ESG standards, because it actually signals. Let me just tell you that if you are able to comply with ESG guidance and standards, it's actually signaling. It signals to the world that you are a worthy investment. I think it's important to say that. And then to help companies, what should entities be looking forward to and working towards when it comes to the best practice for ESG reporting? Make sure that your ESG reporting is centered around your purpose and culture as an organization. Make sure you have an ESG strategy in place. What are you trying to do? The truth about it, you cannot do everything. Remember that you need to be forward-looking as well, so you must aspire to it. There also has to be stakeholder engagement as well. Measurement matters. So if it's not measured, it is not done properly. So make sure you put in the right measurements in there. Consider the environmental and social impacts beyond your organization. So remember, think about, as I said, your vendors, what's the supply chain, all of these things, your customers, what does it mean to you, and as well as all your key talent as well. Think about the governance aspect, which you probably already have. Well, how can you create opportunities for it for you? And then at the end of the day, make sure that whatever you report is balanced, understandable, and is accessible to all. So thank you for listening to me. It was a lot of information, but I hope that you learned from it and that there are quite a number of things that you can take away from it. Thank you very much. And over to you, Oluwaseyi.
All right, thank you very much, Bolanle. It was quite very, very elaborate and insightful. I know we've learned one or two, from key compliance requirements to ESG regulations in general in Africa as a whole. And next, I'll be inviting our last speaker for today, in respect to Dr. Bankole. Please, for those of us that have questions, I'd like us to make use of the Q&A chat box to drop our questions. We'll take that once Dr. Bankole is through with his session. Thank you once again, Mrs. Bolanle, and welcome, Dr. Bankole.
Thank you very much, Oluwaseyi. It's been a lot of learning today already. My name is Bankole. I'm Dr. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's indeed a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. My name is Bankole. I'm Dr. Bankole Alibe. Myself and my colleagues at Transatlantic Development Limited has been working in this aspect of sustainability, ESG practice over the last 20 years, and we support clients globally, from America to the Asias to Australia, Africa, Europe. And basically, we're great to be here. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're just going to share one or two things. Practically, it is really very challenging to speak after experts have spoken, but I'll try to give like a keynote so that we can just, because what I'm going to say is not particularly going to be materially totally different from what has been said today, but it'll just give us a bit of new perspective to the discuss. So the topic is still the same: navigating ESG compliance in Nigeria, ESG regulatory requirements in Nigeria and Africa. So there's no point reinventing the wheel. There's been exhaustive conversation today from all the wonderful speakers about what exactly does ESG entail. And we've spoken extensively about the environmental component, the social component, and the governance component. So there's no point reiterating that, because of course it's evident. On the climate component, the biodiversity component, water, soil, natural environment, wastewater, material, occupational health and safety, corporate health and safety. On the social side, you have the human rights, social inclusion, gender, fragility, conflict and vulnerability, customer support for high street operation or downstream operation, community health and safety, livelihoods, land acquisition and involuntary resettlement, culture, and indigenous people and all of that. And then when it comes to corporate governance, you look at the sustainability governance and you look at the corporate governance, because in reality, corporate governance component is divided into two key areas. So taking the conversation further, we realize that in defining ESG, we're not particularly talking about the entire habitus of sustainability, like Bolanle rightly said. You're talking to the component of sustainability that deals with the risk, because there are parts of the businesses that do not deal with risk. For example, if your project is in, for those who are very familiar with, let's say Nigeria, for example, if your project is in Abuja and you travel down to Kankia in Katsina to renovate a primary school, it's not a risk to your business. That is you being a good citizen, and that is your CSR. So it has nothing to do with the risk to your business. It is your good practice. So we need to define it very clearly so that organizations do not mix it up. ESG is that part of your business that affects, that constitutes risk directly to the business, that if you don't do them, they become a problem. So we need to define that very clearly. And on the social part, of course, it's evident there are things that affect human beings and humanity. I always give an analysis that nobody talks about the size of the cattle in terms of their weight watching. The only reason why we are concerned about any social component is because it affects us. So in summary, the totality of risk, impact, sustainability, or ESG is because these things affect us as human beings. And of course, governance is basically order. So if we can digest it as simple as that, we necessarily might not need safeguards or guidelines. We look at the quality of decision making on a day-to-day basis, not just compliance. Because in my knowledge and practice globally, I believe that compliance or the word regulation does not in entirety captures the requirements that makes people comply or makes people attain the end goal. They might have good reporting, they have good policies in place, they might have good implementation standards, but they might not have good implementation practice. So in reality, the entire sustainability discourse and the habitus of ESG in particular needs to evolve from the corporate culture of the organization. So as a practitioner researcher, I am more interested in the teleology of actually creating what necessitates the knowledge or the learning behind the rationale behind actions that we take. Because if we understand the rationale, it's an organic process. If you know why you do something, then it is easier for you to define if it needs to be done or not to be done. So nobody's forcing anybody to do it. So what I'm trying to do this morning or this afternoon is basically going to help us to understand what are the factors that propels ESG regulatory requirement or ESG compliance. And the first part of it is the regulatory environment. So I'm going to be going into some component to discuss the Nigerian regulatory requirement or some other parts of Africa in a bit. But if you look at economies where ESG compliance is high, there is a direct correlation between regulatory requirement and compliance. Because where there are no laws, the aphorism says where there are no laws, there are no saints. So if there is no regulatory requirement, chances are people do not take initiatives with this because businesses are not particularly set up to be responsible. They are set up to make money. It is the current trend that makes business becoming responsible. So in reality, where regulation is weak, compliance is weak. So, and if you look globally, that is the standard. And you can see people in EPA in America every day saying this is not in the EPA law, so we can still commit this crime, even though they all know it's a crime. But there's a loophole in the policy. Until that loophole is plugged, people will continue to exploit it. The next one is the cultural value. So, of course, people define culture as a way of life of a people. But then the way of life of the people is environmentally influenced because you would never find a traditional fisherman living on a mountain, except if there's a river on the mountain, of course. So it means that our environment determines our culture because it's a way to survive our day-to-day realities. So cultural values is actually being influenced by environmental realities. It means then that our environmental realities, which builds into this culture, it's a critical component of either we comply or not. If our cultural value is that we do businesses without looking at other people's face, then we can actually implement policies or not implement those policies that we think will benefit other people. Another part of it is political stability. Now, according to Sherry Anston in 1969, when she was writing Anston's Ladder of Participation, she defines sustainability and participation as a critical component of democracy, which is the process of which people choose leadership by popular opinion. As a result, a society that has an imbalanced political system will be really, really very difficult for them to actually drive anything that has to do with sustainability or drives to do ESG or compliance or good practice. For example, back in 1985, when the Chinese gorgeous dam crisis was reigning around the world and the World Bank and the other international lenders are implementing policies to ensure there is a safeguard system. In fact, they don't call it safeguard, then they call it the EHSG, Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines for the World Bank and some other international lenders. Nigeria was under a military rule, so nobody would talk about sustainability in Nigeria. If you're doing a project, you have to bulldoze people, you bulldoze them. And even now, the only reason why we're talking about sustainability right now in Nigeria, or for the most part in Africa, is because there's significantly reduced amount of military rule and there is significant penetration of democracy, which gives room for people to actually air their opinion. So the political stature and stability in every environment dictates the level of compliance to sustainability and, in particular, environmental and social governance. Technological advancement is another key component. So when we say technological advancement, we're talking about the level of innovation that has happened in a particular society over time. For example, many years ago, chemicals like Gramaxone, Gramaron, Premextra, and the rest, which has DDT component that lives forever in the ecosystem, that destroys the DNA of people and actually causes genetic mutation to some households, are in circulation and nobody knows about it. And people just think that it's just a normal way. Some people actually think it's a spiritual attack. But the truth of the matter actually is that it's just the DDT component of this chemical that alters the DNA structure of human beings. And then some of them are born with deformation. But because technological advancement at that point cannot detect these things, they go unmonitored. And as a result, they have direct influence on the way we think. Thus, it is critical for us to use technology, or the use of technology actually determines the level of compliance that we get. If we have more time on this call, I'll actually explain some of my experiences at London Business School recently, where CEOs in Europe at the London Business School Summit were explaining to us that they are creating technologies to ensure that ESG and sustainability in general survives. Now, economic conditions. Economic conditions is critical, and you would agree with me that most in emerging economies, the compliance to sustainability is low simply because it is not cheap, like Bolale rightly said. And I always say something in most of my engagements that if it is not financially viable, it cannot be sustainable, because in reality, you cannot put something on top of nothing. And it is very important that you need to consider the financial component or the economic realities before you implement your sustainability deals, because if you're not making money, you can't implement the solutions. That's very clear. The level of development is also a critical factor. Like I said, the level of development determines the level of exposure, and the level of exposure determines the level of money that you have in the system. And that is a spiral effect into how you comply, or how government takes sustainability seriously or they don't. Global influence. There are countries that actually live directly under the influence of the global stature. For example, high handout countries that survive heavily on international influence like grants, aids, and support systems would have very little wriggle weight for them to wriggle out of the international standard when it comes to sustainability standard. So it means that it's not organic to them, but they have to adopt it because they need to ensure that they comply to the funding agency. And ultimately, market demand. Market demand is actually one of the fastest compliance factor in sustainability, like Bonale and Peju was rightly mentioned. Right now in London and even in Walmart, people check the CO2 emission or the CO2 categorization or CO2 tagging of product before they buy them. A typical example is Iceland. Iceland sell things at very cheap price, but going forward, people begin to check, are these free range eggs? Are they eggs in battery cages or eggs in lungs? So these are the factors that actually influence it. And this dynamics and interplay of all of these influence to a large extent how sustainability works. So I don't need to go through this because, I mean, a lot of work has been spent in this direction, talking about international ESG framework. We have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is a good practice goal. You have the World Bank Environmental Official Framework, which is actually an ESG tool that focuses on risk and impact. It's the same thing with the IFC standard, International Financial Corporation, and equally the Equator Principle. All these are risk tools. The UN United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment, it's a good practice tool. The Global Reporting Initiative is a partial sustainability tool because it's not particularly risk focused. There are components within it that actually are CSR. The same thing with carbon disclosure, the same thing with IFRS, up until the creation of the S1 and S2, which some countries are not adopting. But the thing about it actually is that they are risk-based to a large extent, but there are still components of good practice in them. And task force on climate change, good practice tool, sustainability accounting, good practice tool, UN Global Compact, good practice tool, the same thing with international sustainability standards. All these are good practice tools, but they are very critical in measuring at the global level. Now, when it comes to the Africa region, we have the one thing I would want to say before we go further is that if you look at the entire regulatory framework, you will realize that globally, there are general sustainability discourse or regulatory requirements, and there are financial components and there are practice-based components. A typical example of general sustainability component or general regulatory requirement would be like the World Bank Environmental and Social Framework, because it cuts across every, but at the same time it's a financial toolkit, because if you're not borrowing from the World Bank, if you're not interacting with the World Bank, you don't need to comply to it. And if you look at the industry standard, on the other hand, are those that are specific to industry practices. So for example, you don't need IPICEA if you're not in the oil and gas sector. You don't need Roundtable for Sustainable Biofuel Production if you're not in biofuel production. You don't need RSPO if you're not in oil palm production. So these are the differences, and that's why I'm trying to put it out here so that we can all understand that not all of this actually applies to you. It depends on where you are, what you're doing, and the industry in which you operate or who you interact with as a stakeholder. So, of course, Bolale has been gracious to explain some of these already. So I'll just go straight to some other practice that we have across. I think she's mentioned a lot of this as well. The Ghana Environmental Protection Agency, the Competitive Inclusion in Lesotho, the Mauritius Stock Exchange, Botswana Stock Exchange, Kenya Green Bond, Kenya Capital Market, National Environmental Council of Tanzania, South African Green Finance, Moroccan Code of Corporate Governance, and so on and so forth. These are agencies that have clear-cut standards in how they treat ESG in their own country. However, in mentioning this, I would like to provide clarification that when we say they provide guidance on ESG, it does not necessarily mean that they woke up and say, this is our ESG guidelines. They have principles that have direct reference to ESG in entirety, but they have not sat out one day to say, this is our ESG framework. So just so we're clear. Now, in Nigeria, very importantly, I want to point out that on the environmental side, we have the Constitution of Federal Republic of Nigeria. We have the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, that's the EI Act of 1992. We have the Industrial Act of 2018, the Harmful Waste Act of 1988, the Water Resources Act of 1993, Petroleum Industry Act of 2021, Climate Change Act of 2021, and we have so many other state laws. We have the Kaduna State Free Layer Law, Framework for Responsible and Inclusive Land Intensive Agriculture. We have the same thing in Ogun State. We have the Jigawa LAF, which is Land Action and Requirement Framework. All these are ESG-related policy frameworks that actually operate in Nigeria on the environmental side. On the social side, we have the Labour Act of 1974, the National Commission Museum Monument Act, which deals with a cultural heritage and transferred procedure under the international standard. We have the National Housing Act, we have the National Social Insurance, Industrial Training Fund, Pension Reform Act, Health Insurance, and Employee Compensation. Now, these components may look very extraneous, like they actually don't speak to a reality in our sense when we think about ESG. But in reality, anything that constitutes risk to our social balance or that could constitute social dysfunctionality naturally becomes an ESG social risk and naturally falls into this category. So for a moment, like I said at the beginning, stop for a moment to think about it as a framework defined by somebody in Switzerland or in America. Think about it as what constitutes risk to our environmental balance, our social balance, and our corporate balance in terms of corporate governance and sustainability governance. And on the corporate side, we have the Nigerian Sustainable Banking Principle, we have the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance, Nigerian Stock Exchange Sustainability Disclosure Guideline, the SEC Code, the Company and Allied Matters Act, which is CAMA, compliance, income tax, and so on and so forth. Then the Financial Reporting Council, banks and other financial institutions. There are lots of these components, but the thing is that they actually hasn't been consolidated into a single document for us to see. But again, depending on where you are in your practice, if you're a financial institution, some of these affect you directly. If you're in manufacturing, for example, and if you're not borrowing money from a bank in Nigeria, you might not necessarily need to comply with Nigerian Sustainability Banking Principle. However, you might need to comply to IFC Performance Standard, which also have a similar standard and framework. Now, in terms of harmonizing the sustainability across Africa, there has been a lot of effort that has been made. For example, there are a lot of conversations around the Africa Free Trade Agreement. We are talking about the sustainability component. And it's also, there is the ECOWAS Regional Economic program, which is the ECOWAS Environmental Action Plan of 2020 to 2026, which has actually done a lot of stuff. The objective of it is actually to strengthen environmental governance, promote sustainable management of resources, and then fighting against pollution and promoting information, education, and communication for better environment. These are integration programs that has actually been carried out to ensure that by the end of 2026, there will be an integrated sustainability discourse across Africa, like a kind of rallying point for the entire sustainability discourse, so that we can have a central database like you have in Europe, that we can say, according to the European standard, according to African standard, this is how we want to address sustainability going forward. So my time is really very short. Apologies, I'm rushing a little bit. I would like to talk about the impact of integrated ESG compliance to business. The first part is Safer Planet. Safer Planet in this essence that if you do good business and you protect the environment, you're basically protecting your life. And if you do not have life, of course, business is useless. Cogito ergo sum. We only know because we're here. If we're not here, we would not know. And then they foster innovation. Naturally, because of the cost of sustainability and the complexity of the practice, it will naturally force organizations to be innovative in preparing solutions to themselves. Then revenue protection. So in project management, there is revenue generation and there's revenue protection. One of the surest insurance and revenue protection tool globally is actually complying to ESG practices, because it helps you to actually create an environment where you're making money today and you can make money in the future. And then it's resource efficiency. Of course, one of the key components of sustainability or even environmental and social risk is what you find in what the IFC Performance Standard 4 or World Bank ESF 4 or PR4 in Asia Development Bank or EBRD, which talks about resource efficiency and protection of waste and hazardous material. When you implement proper ESG framework, it will give you resource efficiency, which helps you to actually make very useful decisions and protect the planet wherever you operate. Accurate valuation is another component because, like I said, if it's not financially viable, it cannot be sustainable. So when you have your ESG on the top notch of your business analysis, chances are the valuation of your business will always be accurate, because people know where your risks are and will know where your advantages are when it comes to the entire exposure of the business. Another one is risk management. The entire ESG toolkit back in the day, about 10-15 years ago, is under the risk portfolio, because it's basically a risk management framework. Because if you're able to mitigate your ESG risk totally, your financial risk will sort itself, because the entire financial exposure is under proper governance. And once you have proper governance in place, you hire the right people, you have the right technology, you have the right system in place, naturally, you will solve your risk problem. Then improved reputation. Like Bolale said, and has also been said by Olakweju earlier today, one of the biggest risks, particularly in the age of social media, is reputation management. Because you can say something in Nigeria in 1974, and it will not make it out of Lagos until the newspaper in Lagos gets to, or people listen to the radio in Ibadan or somewhere up north in Kano. But today, if you say something in your village, in my village, and if I say it now, and there's somebody who has a mobile phone with 2 megabytes of data, that thing can actually be read in Venezuela in 2 minutes or less. It's just a question of internet, and then it goes global. So there is a huge reputational conundrum hanging on the head of every business, and this can easily be managed by improved reputation through proper ESG implementation. Market edge investment is another one, because if you have your ESG data in place and in good condition, it gives you an informed position to make improved business decisions. And ultimately, all this constitutes proper financial performance. And like I always say, if you don't have a sustainable business, you do not have a business. So when you have a sustainable business, you have a business. So what are the biggest challenges when it comes to effective ESG implementation? From a pedagogic perspective, the first part of it is knowledge gap. So metacognitively, if knowledge actually creates a sense of awareness that influences decision. If you know about something, if you know it so much, like some of my professor colleagues will say, if you know it so well, you say it's so simple. There is no point for complicating it. So knowledge gap actually helps to reshape the way people think and help to reshape their attitude and behavior towards a particular perspective. So people greenwash today. Why? Because they don't know. Because every time you greenwash, you're setting yourself up for failure. It's a very simple analogy, because you're basically saying things that you're not doing to allow the public to make a different perspective of you, which will eventually put you in trouble over time. So knowledge gap is a very critical component. The second one is weak policy. Like I said earlier, the weaker the policy, the lower the compliance, the lower the outcome. And then weak enforcement. So when people don't know what they are doing I remember reporting to one government agency about 5 years ago about the pollution in Osun State, about the pollution of mining, illegal mining activities in Osun State. And the person said, well, I don't think they're doing anything wrong. They have the permission of the local government to do it. And I said, well, they're destroying the ecosystem. They're cutting down cocoa trees, cutting down kola nut trees, burning the entire environment, digging to the earth, pouring mercury into it, pouring cyanide into it so that they can extract gold. And the person said, well, we don't have any law against it, and I don't think they're doing anything wrong. Now, that level of lack of knowledge formed, which is also strengthened by weak policy, has led to weak implementation, which ultimately is causing death of the people by their numbers in every community that has illegal mining in Nigeria today, and some other part of Nigeria and other part of Africa, like you have in Bole Bamboy in Ghana, in northwestern region of Bole Bamboy in Ghana, and some other parts of Africa, even in Sierra Leone, around the river in Sierra Leone. Now, lack of centralized matrix, because there is no central thinking pot. So people navigate the loopholes in every country that they operate, particularly businesses. They say, oh, let me save myself some money by not doing this. Let me save myself some money without doing that. Now, you can make money at the beginning, but there's no revenue protection for you in the future because all these things are going to fall on your face. The next one is legal liability and accountability. There is no legality when it comes to ESG framework. For example, I've heard investors tell me in Nigeria, particularly local investors, saying that it is easier for you to run against the EIA Act in Nigeria than for you to comply, because it's going to cost you about 50 million naira to do, or 100 million naira to do an EIA or ESIA for a modular refinery. And if you do not do it, and you're going to be punished by Ministry of Environment, you only pay 1.5 million naira. So why do you need to comply? So there is no incentive for good behavior. So that is the legal and liability gap. And then there is inadequate political will. I doubt if there is any standing committee today that understand the total picture of what ESG entails. And if there is, I don't think they're doing anything a lot on it to actually ensure that this is actually being reversed. Finally, is the poor funding component. Because most board and executive management team have very little knowledge of ESG. They call it CSR, and they think it's something that is not important, because the body language is that we're doing it because we have money. If you don't have money, there's nothing we can do about it. People oftentimes fail to understand that this is a risk factor that actually drives business. So, strategies for effective ESG implementation. There are 1,001 strategies that can help ESG implementation. I've only kept a simple map here so that we can think about it and apply this to where it fits within our business thinking. The first bit of it is that you need to understand the organizational ESG risk. Oftentimes people say, oh, you have to do materiality assessment. Well, that's not totally correct. What you need to do is to understand within your business what constitutes risk, what constitutes impact, what constitutes good practice, what constitutes CSR. Now, when you have this total picture, you'll be able to make an informed decision. The next bit of it is to set clear ESG goals and objectives. So what are your goals? What are your objectives? And this needs to align directly. And this is where copying or stealing other people's policy does not work. Because if you work in a downstream in the petroleum sector and you apply the policy that applies to downstream, you will fail, because you are operating in two different environments. The same thing if you're in the manufacturing sector and you start operating in the FMCG sector, or you copy policy that's meant for FMCG sector without proper analysis of where you operate in the ecosystem, you're going to get into trouble as well, because you have different set of stakeholders and different sets of priorities, inputs, outputs, and value chain system. So it is critical for you to really understand where are you. And then you need to map and manage stakeholders. Again, I'll go to Einstein. Engaging your stakeholder is the lifeblood of your business. And I mean stakeholder in every sense of it. So it is critical for you to really understand who your stakeholders are and how they interact with your business for you to move ahead. Now, you need to integrate ESG into the core business practice. Oftentimes, professionals, business leaders, and particularly boards think that ESG is a cumbersome transaction. They think it's difficult for you to implement and it's just cost. They don't see the business perspective to it. And this is because of knowledge gap and because of lack of innovation. But if you're able to analyze your business critically and involve professionals and experts to think through the sustainability discourse with you, you will realize that you stand a lot more to gain in ESG than you stand to lose or you stand to run in terms of costs. Another one is investment in knowledge and innovation. Like I was introduced, we have a Center for Sustainability and Participatory Development and so many other institutions across Nigeria and Africa and globally that deals with sustainability leadership improvements. Because organizations do not know, they make an uninformed decision and it becomes to bite us at the back. So it is critical for us to really understand how sustainability affects our business so that we can own the process and drive the process. Truth of the matter is, if you don't own and drive it, you basically be following the wind, and oftentimes you make the wrong decision because business wants to make profit. And because business wants to make profit, you have to go through some compromises, and this compromise oftentimes jeopardize ESG. Some people can say, oh, because we are running short of budget, we have to cut down by 10%, ESG has to go. Okay, ESG has to be cut by 50%. And that way you suffer it because you don't know what you're doing. And oftentimes it's just a management decision and it's just made at the board, where even times for organizations that do not have sustainability leadership, the ESG expert is not even on the table. So that's why that's important. Then extend the frontiers of sustainability leadership and leadership along value chain. Now, it is very important for us to do your sustainability discourse well, but it's even far more important for you to spread it in your area of practice among your immediate stakeholders and along your value chain. Think about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 when it comes to climate, for example. The same thing is how you need to deal with the entire sustainability habitus, or let's say in the minimum, your ESG habitus across your organizations, your immediate stakeholders, and your wider stakeholders. It is very critical. And importantly, we cannot use the knowledge of yesterday to solve the problem of today and expect to be in business tomorrow. So ultimately, there is need for continuous improvement along our ESG journey. And importantly, we need to protect our sustainability journey with stakeholders. And that means that we need to set a standard for ourselves and continue to benchmark our productivity over the years of business operation. I think I've been very good with the time. My name is Bankole. I work for TDL. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Bankole. It was also very, very insightful. Thanks for sharing the impacts of integrated ESG compliance to business. You also mentioned the challenges and risks for effective ESG implementation, as well as the strategies for effective ESG implementation. And I think one thing I'm going to take out from here, I think where you mentioned a non-sustainable business is not having a business at all. I think somebody also mentioned put that in the comments section. Thank you very much once again. So quickly, would need to go to the Q&A segment. And I would also like to appreciate all the speakers from Peju to Bolanle to Bankole for the insightful presentations. And we have like about 3 questions in the Q&A section. For those that do not have access to the Q&A chat box, please drop your questions on the chat box itself. So you can drop your questions on the chat box if you do not have access to the Q&A menu. And this last session will be handled by Mrs. Bolanle Adekoya from PwC, and questions will be answered by all presenters for today. Thank you very much. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, so we can start with the questions already in the Q&A section. Okay, so the first question is, for a social impact organization operating in Nigeria, which of the ESG regulations would you recommend to prioritize, even though all the regulations are important? That's the first question. And then second one is, how would you advise to scale up to cover all the major regulations? Bankole, do you want to answer that? So it says, for a social impact organization operating in Nigeria, which of the ESG regulations would you recommend to prioritize, even though all the regulations are important? And then how would you advise them to scale up? So this is from Babajide Fadekwe asking this question.
Thank you.
Macaulay,
Thank
can
you
you
very
please answer
much.
that? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bolale. So when you say for a social impact organization operating in Nigeria, which ESG regulation would you recommend to prioritize? Now, when you say you are a social investment organization, that is a very broad thing to say. And I'll explain to you why. If you run a primary school in Agiding, if you run a private primary school in Agiding and you give 20 students or half of your students scholarship, it's a social investment. If you're selling, what's it called? Stove, this stove that is efficient in power consumption, that reduces exposure, it's also social investment. If you go to Maiduguri and say, oh, we're running support system for the people in the IDP camp, it's also a social investment program. So, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, the sector of the economy that you operate, your part, that's your corner, is what you need to prioritize, because there are endless national laws and international standards that you can comply with. So those that deals with you are those that you need to deal with. For example, if you work in the watch sector, you have water, sanitation, and hygiene. And what are your key tools in that environment? You have water, you have safe toilets, you have hand wash, you have hygiene, you have food security, you have food sovereignty, you have nutrition, and there are guidelines everywhere at the state level. It might not be at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and at the international level. So think about that, your corner of the world, and just paint it properly. So that's exactly how it works, and there are national standards for it. For example, because we don't know what area you're talking about, that area would have a law that governs it, that are risk and impact within the ESG habitus. So your policy around land use, for example, your policy around water use, your policy around energy consumption, your policy around recycling, your policy around waste disposal, your policy around, depending on what you do. So you cannot begin to implement, and I'm sorry to use this example because I think I've used it quite a bit. You cannot begin to implement Nigeria's sustainable banking principle when you're not in the financial sector. I hope that clarifies. So you need to look at your part of the world and say, what applies to me? According to the World Bank, we call it what triggers or what applies. So what risk do you trigger in your operation? Those are the things that should drive your sustainability thinking. And what do you prioritize? You prioritize what concerns you. And more importantly, before you begin to prioritize, think about the innovation as well, because the whole idea of ESG, if you look at it from the perspective of the international financial institution, is for you to be able to redesign your project in a profitable manner that is still sustainable. I hope that clarifies. Thank you.
Thank you, Bankole. Babajide, I'm just going to add two more things to what Bankole has said. An easy low-hanging fruit is if you have, for example, not decided maybe what SDG goals that you want to comply with, because you, as I said, because you are social impact. So when you think about the sustainable development goals, that's an easy one. So maybe pick a few that you may want to, and then you can then look at the risks and opportunities around there and then put in policies in there. That's one. And the second one is the governance around the organization. If you have not done putting governance around your, okay, so for example, things like how you spend money, who approves what, how you report what, how you employ people, that's another easy one for you to start with, in addition to all that Bankole has said as well. Yeah, for Babajide. So another question, now this one is actually for you, Dr. Bankole. So it talks about tech advancement. I don't know if you've seen that. So it says, on tech advancement as a factor for ESG compliance, can you expatiate how AI fits into this and how AI can be an enabler? I love AI. I use it for everything now, but yeah. Go on.
Okay, this is a very interesting question, because sometimes I think in May or June this year, graciously, I was part of the global team that is actually working on what is called the Tech for ESF, which is basically integrating the current technical advancements in terms of AI, machine learning, Hadoop platform, and other modern business toolkits into environmental and social framework, both at the World Bank and at the Asia Development Bank. So it's basically like a regional meetup in Washington, D.C. And we basically spent about 10 days basically thinking about how does ESG risk, impact, sustainability, how do they actually integrate when it comes to the modern business toolkit like AI? And I can tell you for a fact that organizations like IFC, like the World Bank, already have what they call tech for ESF. They have Manila in at the IFC. There is another one in Asia Development Bank that will be named in a matter of days. And the way it works is actually that if you think about it, I don't know how much the acquirer knows about ESG practice when it comes to risk and impact. Many years ago, many years ago, let's say about 20 years ago, when I started practice, we used to go to communities to ask questions on hard copy tools, and then you come back, you input it into Excel, and from Excel, you start calculating the cells and all of that. But today, and I'm not going to AI yet. I'm going to simple Microsoft Office productivity tool. Today we use Microsoft Office. We use ODK platform and other platform to collect data, and then when you collect the data, you analyze it using back office board system, which is a back office arrangement system to analyze this data, and ultimately you generate chart graphs in few seconds or in few minutes. Now, that all of that has moved away. That is becoming obsolete now because we don't even need all of that. All you need to do is basically like what they call in Asia Development Bank, we call it the SPADE. SPADE is Special Data Analysis and Documentation Equipment, which actually create like a geodatabase system by itself, harvesting all the data that's been collected in that environment and basically create a system of machine learning to learn the impact of previous projects and basically helps you to create a summary that you don't even need to go to the community. You just go there to triangulate. So AI is at the center of modern thinking when it comes to sustainability and technology, because there is going to be a very massive touching point very soon. And the learning is steep, even for someone like myself who has been in the practice all my life. This is the only thing I do. And the learning has been steep because you can now begin to realize that the entire body of knowledge is unifying together. And technology is doing that. So AI is a critical component of it, but also there is a bit of concern, which I think is the area you're going to ask when you say already is an enabler, but it's also a concern around governance, because if you look at some AI can also be used to generate negative feedback and generate, because it's also an input system. It's like putting information on some fake websites, and then people can say, oh, you can Google it. And you Google it, you actually found it. The fact that it's available on the internet does not mean that it's actually accurate or is correct. So basically, there is a huge disclosure coming very soon about AI and sustainability, particularly on the risk and impact component. But there are concerns, significant global concern in terms of anonymization, data protection, governance, and ultimately in terms of putting a human face to the entire sustainability discourse. Yeah, so that's how that works. Thank you.
Thank you, Bankole, for that. So we have a question here from Oguntoye Raphael. He says, how can we as an insurance company effectively integrate ESG risk into our existing risk management framework? I can take that. So first of all, you need to do a gap assessment. Yeah, so you actually need to do a gap assessment between the requirements. So once you've identified the standards that you think that you're supposed to be complying with, given your industry and the different areas, you need to do a gap assessment between what you currently have and where you need to go. Once you have done that, then you can come up with proper an action plan or map of how you then do, and then you break it down across the organization. And when you do this, please ensure that you have the right stakeholders in the room. So it's not something that one team does. You may need to have various iterations. You may also choose to have a facilitator, a consultant, whether myself and colleague, whoever, who can actually help you facilitate that session to just make sure that all the different areas that you want to adhere to, and then you can then prioritize them. We talk about this risk and opportunities, we talk about materiality, then you can prioritize them, because the truth about it is that there'll be a lot of things that will probably come up with like 7,500 things. However, realistically, what can you do? You have to look at the cost benefit analysis and start from somewhere. So that's what I would suggest for you, Ogutoye Raphael. So there's this question here from Tosin. It says that also, if we view ESG only through the risk management lens, are we not missing the broader value and purpose of sustainability, which also considers opportunities, long-term, systematic challenges, ethical obligations, and potential for innovation and positive impact? So Tosin, I'm hoping that you did not take that alone from all we have said. We actually did talk about the opportunities for it. We actually talked about the social impact. Please note that there's a lot more. It's not just our risk. The reason why Bankole talked about risk is because when it comes to the regulatory part of it, you know, when it comes to regulators are trying to mitigate. They're trying to protect, in that sense, the various areas, stakeholders in that sense. That is why there was a bit of that. But we're hoping that you also see the fact that there's actually a lot more long-term benefits that will come from that. So it's not just about risk. There's a lot more that can come from that. So please let's take that and be guided as well. Okay, so there's a question here which I'd like Olapeju to answer. I hope Olapeju you are still on. It talks about, in the context of ESG, the environmental and social pillars often dominate discussions due to their immediate visibility and urgency. However, the economic pillar is equally crucial for long-term sustainability. How can we better integrate and highlight the importance of economic sustainability in ESG strategies to ensure a balanced and comprehensive approach? So when I think, Olapeju, are you available to answer that? Because I think maybe they're mixing, Olubumi might be mixing it up a little bit. Olapeju, are you available to answer the question?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay, Bolanle, thank you so much. So I'm going to go down a memory lane a bit to the first time I did a sustainability report in line with the GRI reporting template. You realize that template allows you balance all the materiality components. So you're not prioritizing one while leaving the other. And I remember then there was a focus on economic sustainability, because if you are not economically sustainable, there's no way, there's really nothing to, there's no risk to manage. If there's no business, there's no risk to manage. If there's no business, there's no framework you're talking about. So the economic viability, financial viability, if I remember very well, was the most important. Then after you focus on the, after reporting on the elements under financial, then we go on to the other elements. So far as I'm concerned, economic is extremely important. Excuse me. Sorry, that was a risk I was trying to manage there. But then,
That's
Bolanle,
all right.
you understand
We
what I was saying?
understand. Please carry on.
Please proceed, Bolanle.
Okay, yes. No, thank you for that. So Olubumi, I mean, as I said, it's you are right about putting in a balanced approach, and however, you have to make sure that the strategies around it and separating the needs is very important, like Olapeju mentioned. Just quickly before I go to the next section, Babajide, thank you for the clarification. You're saying that social impact that enables access to finance for MSMEs and skill acquisition for individual persons. Well, there's so many things that you can do. There's so many online trainings you can do. You can have sessions that you can join. For finance, there's a number of organizations that are currently giving finance for it, but please remember that you must have the foundations first of all. And what I said through about the SDG goals still hold true, because those are usually low-hanging fruit, and you'll find that certain grants always look at this thing. So what are you doing? And make sure what you are doing has purpose. So where is the purpose behind what you are doing? So there's another question here. It says, how best can companies or organizations influence the communities where they operate so the stakeholder engagement can become seamless? Gosh, that is a very broad question. There's quite a number of things you can do. But earlier on, remember we both Bankole and I talked about the fact that, you are dealing with various stakeholders. So for example, if it's community-based, you can look at the corporate social responsibility side of it, making sure that you are doing things on purpose and it must be aligned with a particular risk in your area. So whether it's an environmental thing, whether you're looking at an SDG goals, you have to define what works for you, and then you communicate it. It has to be something that's measurable and you can communicate it. It's important that you're able to do that. So whether it's communicating through reporting, whether it's communicating through your other activities that you're doing, then that is very, very important that you're able to do that. So there's a question here that says, how can a professional in the ESG, okay, sorry, I'll read it as this and hopefully we can figure it out. How can professional in the ESG improve compliance among politically interested parties or political stakeholders to solve ESG compliance issues in Nigeria? Bankole, do you want to take this? Because this one is a $50 million question.
So I would start with just adding a little bit to what you have said, which is very correct about the communities that you operate. So when it comes to managing communities, the entire conversations around communities sits within your what is called a particular risk tool called your stakeholder engagement management plan. So your stakeholder engagement management plan helps you to conduct a proper feasibility, map, engage, and strategize around who are your stakeholders, what are the stakes of your stakeholders, what is your understanding on the other person's stakes. So somebody is a politician and you want to engage him, you want his buy-in, but at the same time, you cannot be identified with his political party or his political aspiration. So how do you manage it and all of that? This is a traditional ruler. How do you want to engage with him? So your stakeholder engagement has that plan. So it is methodical in nature. So you need to map all of that, and that will guide you. And there's what is called the engagement buy-in system, which helps you to map what is the level of buy-in you gain in FY1, FY2, FY3, or Q1, Q2, Q3 up until the end. So let's keep that on one side. So that is just adding to what you already said about managing communities. So managing political stakeholders when it comes to business ESG risk, it's a very complex discourse. But there is one solution that never fails, and that solution is knowledge. Like I said earlier, pedagogically and metacognitively, which means in the art of learning and the act of knowing what you know or writing down or documenting what you know, one thing is very clear. Knowledge changes the attitude and behavior of people. The simple aphorism, if you put a 2-year-old, if a 2-year-old sees a light on the candle, as small as it is, he likes it, it's beautiful. He or she wants to touch it. If you say no, the child might be upset. But once the child touches it and there is a bonding in the finger, learning will naturally take place. And when learning takes place, it becomes a permanent change of behavior to that character. It's the same thing. Of course, we don't need to allow politicians to get into trouble, but we need to ensure that they have adequate knowledge and the potential risk that exists within their course of action. And not just talk about this risk, we talk about the financial implication of this risk. For example, it's difficult to explain to people how picketing works, but it is easier to say that if you, as an oil company, if you don't do this, you get picketed. If you get picketed, you will not be able to operate. If you don't operate, it means that your 7,000 barrels per day will go to zero, and your staff still needs to be paid for the day. Your reputation will go down. Everybody will drag you on social media, and they will see you as a poorly performing MD. And you're going to lose X amount of money in Naira or in dollar. That's very succinct. People understand what that is because it's now a financial issue. Because ESG issue quickly becomes, it's the same thing as a politician. If you behave like this, people will see you like that, and this will be the course of action, and you might not lose election, but you lose popularity. And which means that if you ever have a candidate that is of your stature financially, that can match you for all of these things and add this little component of ESG that we're talking about, you're likely going to lose your position. So that is the trading. But again, like I said, knowledge never fails. You need to ensure that you're able to map them properly and look at their area of interest and create a bit of learning. Because once learning takes place, it will change the way they react to such conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Bankole. So we've run out of time, but just to close, I know there are a few questions around capacity building and certifications and things. So please do your research. There's quite a lot of things, for example, even PwC, we have some training that we're starting next month. I'm sure different organizations and certifications that you can do. However, the time to act is now, and knowledge is power in that sense. But thank you everyone for your questions. And I'm going to hand over to, I think, is it Oluwaseyi? Are you the one sort of taking over? So we can do the final bits. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, thank you very much, Mrs. Bolanle. All right, as we come to the end of this webinar, I'd like to appreciate all our partners from PwC to NECA to LBS, LCCI, Sterling Bank, and NGX, and UNIDO-ITPO. Thank you so much for your partnership. I'd also extend this to all our speakers for today, Dr. Bankole, Mrs. Bolanle Adekoya, and Molapeju Ibekwe. Thank you so much for the insightful session. And I'm sure and for sharing your expertise with us. I'm sure we've all learned one or two. Our next ESG will be coming up by the end of September. We'll communicate once we finalize on the dates with everyone. And to all participants here today, we say a very big thank you for joining us. And I think I just want us to take this away. We should remember that this conversation does not end here. Let's continue to engage. Let's collaborate with ourselves and to advance ESG initiatives across the globe. So we'll also be dropping the feedback form. Like, I think all participants should assist us in filling the form and sharing their feedback with us to help us improve better. And at this stage, I would like to thank you all once again and do have a great day. Thank you everyone for joining us.